Okay, it's great to have everybody tonight. And we're just doing online tonight, so I'm back in my office and not where I normally am, but that's okay. Um, and we're going to just continue our conversation about Job, where we left off last week. And where we left off last week, really, we had gotten Job to the end of chapter or to the middle of chapter 23. I think we still have one more section of chapter 23 to look at, maybe a couple of them. And but we had gotten him to the point where he's answering back Eliphaz the last time Eliphaz has spoken. And Job, in his answer to Eliphaz, has, um, to Eliphaz's suggestion that he find God, um, is that he would love to, and that the dilemma is that it is impossible, really. And we took a look at this piece of the passage last week. I'm going to go on forward, and we'll start off here in verses 13 through 17 of Job. But he is unique, and who can make him change? And whatever his soul desires, that he does. For he performs what is appointed for me, and many such things are with him. Therefore, I am terrified at his presence. When I consider this, I am afraid of him. For God made my heart weak, and the Almighty terrifies me, because I was not cut off from the presence of darkness, and he did not hide deep darkness from my face. I'm inclined here to think that Job is not really complaining. I don't think he's complaining that God has not dealt fairly with him. But I think he's forcing himself to be patient in this current situation that he finds himself. He speaks great truths here, really. He talks about how God doesn't need help in his counsels. He doesn't have to have advice. He's not swayed. There's nobody who can alter his judgment. And he says, yeah, it's true that righteous prayer can change God's providence if we believe in the scriptures, and certainly what they believed, but never is his purpose and will changed. He knows his ways, and he's sure. And so the fact that, they insinuated that Job just hadn't prayed well enough just wasn't right. And so Job speaks of that. He talks about how God's power is irresistible, that what God wants, he does, and that nothing gets in his way. Men desire a lot of things that they may not really do, or they can't do, or they don't dare to do, but not God. God's not like that. His sovereignty is awesome. His will is perfect, pure, and right, and completely what is needed to fulfill his purposes, even for us. And so if we don't understand, or if something is not the way that we think that it should be, it is always within the will of God. He talks about how God does everything according to the counsel of his will. He performs the thing that is appointed for me, he says in these verses. Whatever happens to us, it's God that performs it. And we will understand all the mystery when he appears. And that's what Job knew. We have all we need, he says. We get what we need. We're equipped for what we need to be faithful. And that's really what matters. This journey is just about the destination. And we have everything we need to get there. We just have to trust in God. And Job was hanging on by his fingertips at this point to that. He says that God does as is his way, and it has always been the way that he does, according to the way that he always does. Many such things are with him, he says. In other words, he does many things in the course of his providence, which we can give no account of, but that we have to be at peace with. And know that our case is not unique. We're not alone in the afflictions and the trials that we that we suffer. The same thing has happened due to the providential allowances of God to others. 1 Peter 5 and verse 9 says the same afflictions are accomplished in our brethren. Are we sick? Are we sore? Are we poor? Are we alone? Are we betrayed? Are we married? Are we unmarried? Do we have children? Do we lose children? Do we have friends who have been unkind to us? Are we afflicted and not have the needs, our worldly, earthly needs met? Are we hungry? He says many such things are in him. They always have been. They've always existed. That's always been within God's will for people to be in these situations. And so he's talking to men who have accused him of being the reason. And he says, but it's always been. And he says, and when I give this consideration of him, it makes me understand that much, and yet it still terrifies me. I know that this has always been the way it is. I know that men have always been afflicted. I know that we all have to suffer and that we all have to come forth and through the fire, refined. But I'm still troubled by this. When I consider, I'm afraid, he says, because affliction is life. It is, and it always has been. Always. In fact, if we were to really, in our lifetime, in the place where we are born, really consider afflictions that men have endured throughout the generations and years, thousands of years on earth, we really pale in comparison in many circumstances. And yet, the things that vex the soul happen to all of us. And he says, it is terrifying when I consider that. I'm afraid because affliction is life. And it's not going to change. And so we tremble, fearing God, and therefore striving harder to obey him, even when it is hard. And my survival means I must continue to contend with this life. And yet, verse 17, if he had been called to the grave before his afflictions, he would have thought that was hard. I mean, the thought of dying gets easier the harder life is. There's no question about that. As we watch someone work their way through an illness, where finally they're taken in an illness, we see that transformation of the mind. Our troubles and our afflictions make us yearn for heaven. The imperfections that we deal with make us want death. I mean, Job has over and over stressed that he longs for death. His friends have accused him and made him guilty of that being a sin. And he says it's not a sin. That when we live life brings trials and tribulations, and it makes us weary. That's why we are admonished to stay faithful, to stay energized, to continue to do good. We do not ever want to quit working. It is what allows us to see those glimpses of heaven. And so he says, had I been taken before the afflictions a lot earlier, death would have been a lot harder for me. That's why young people, it's hard for a young person who's about to get married to ever think that they would want to die. Their life is in front of them. They've got it all figured out. They don't, but they think they do. And yet as life wears on us all, which it does, heaven becomes dearer to us, especially as we lose those who are there. And so he says it would have been a lot easier because he was left to live so long in his troubles and the darkness was not covered from his face. He had to deal with this darkness. It wasn't hidden by the grave. He doesn't find death hard at all, but it's a blessing. And we can bear the darkness better when we have come through the darkness, right? We can bear death easier when we come through the darkness. The truth is, God governs the world, and we can be sure he is aware of everything going on. He continues in the next chapter to start with this train of thought. Since times are not hidden from the Almighty, why do those who know him see not his days? Some remove landmarks. They seize flocks violently and feed on them. They drive away the donkey of the fatherless. They take the widow's ox as a pledge. They push the needy off the road. All the poor of the land are forced to hide. Indeed, wild donkeys in the desert, they go out to their work searching for food. The wilderness yields food for them and their children. They gather their fodder in the field and glean in the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked without clothing and have no covering in the cold. They are wet with showers of the mountains and huddle around the rock for want of shelter. Some snatch the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge from the poor. They cause the poor to go naked without clothing. They take away the sheep from the hungry. They press out oil within their walls and tread wine presses, yet suffer thirst. The dying groan in the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out, yet God does not charge them with wrong. He's talking about the fact that all of the accusations that have been flown his way, all of the now almost end, we have a little bitty section that Bildad will speak again, but the friends have almost quit talking. But if you think about everything that they have said, they have made the assumption that it is evil that has caused Job to be in the situation he's in. And he says, the truth is God governs the world, and we can be sure that he's aware of everything going on. Bad times are not hidden from him. Even when bad men who make our days bad say, oh, he's forgotten us. He's not looking at us. He doesn't know anything about us. He's not working. He's forgotten. He knows everything. Even when bad men and evil men act the way they do, which is what this discussion is about, he's watching. He hadn't forgotten them. He knows all, and every man's times are in his hand, under his eye and under his control. He's got it, Job says. This is not about him allowing an evil man. He knows when an evil man dies before he's punished. It's not as if that evil man has escaped him, he says. It's not like these evil men die and all of a sudden God says, oh, I forgot to punish him. It's not a surprise to God. He just observes general truths here. Even when we have a very difficult time really reconciling these truths, I think one of the hardest things, and we talked about that in this class, injustices performed by men which are allowed to continue on and on and on. It's a really, really hard thing for us to deal with. But he talks about tyrants, those that do wrong. Like Ecclesiastes 3:16 says, seen under the sun, wickedness in the place of judgment. They thrive on the earth. They steal, they cheat in real estate. They'll take inheritance from their brothers and sisters and tread on the rights of their neighbors. That's what's being discussed here. They don't have any concern for the prosperity or for the goodness of others. They take landmarks, they take flocks. They have no compassion as long as they are prospering. They take every opportunity to derail, to deride the unfortunate. Talks about how even the needy, they push the needy off the road. They mislead the less fortunate. They have the upper hand. They'll tell them lies that serve themselves well. They think themselves better. They make fools of those who are without and who don't have any influence. They make fun of them. These are disgusting people. They're gross and arrogant and unkind. They speak ill of others. They take advantage of the misfortunes of others. They oppress those who work for them. They don't consider fair wages, even when the laborer is worthy of more, even in the cities with merchants and traders. We make it burdensome for somebody who might owe us something, or we seek justice even when we don't need it. We live in a culture of these people that are entitled to everything. Somebody owes me. Somebody did me wrong. Somebody should give me this. I deserve this. It is a disgusting way for men to dwell. And Job says there's people like this all over the place. We know that. We live among these people, those who are ungrateful insincere, they have no compassion. They don't consider the hard work of others. They're ready to get rich quick. They want to be given something without work. He speaks of the robber, those that do wrong by violence. They are wild and untamed. They are fierce and furious. They have no respect for the law. These are horrible people that Job reminds us of. Those who God allows to continue in their activity without punishment. This happens throughout our world. It happens all the time. This earth does not reap judgment, not in the truest sense. That's why God has to remind us that vengeance is his, it's not ours. We just have to make sure we're not these people. And I will tell you that some of these characteristics, they can run in the veins of some who even say that they are righteous. We must never think ourselves better or make fun or think that somebody owes us something or hold somebody accountable for something that they cannot do. And yet Job says God does not charge them for wrong, even when their victims cry out. Even when the victims are crying out and they're groaning in the city, God doesn't charge them with wrong. Look at the last verse. Souls are wounded and they cry out. And God says, I'll take care of it. I got this. This is my business. This is my earth. I got it. There are those who rebel against the light. They do not know its ways, nor abide in its paths. The murderer rises in the light. He kills the poor and the needy. And in the night, he is like a thief. The eye of the adulterer waits for twilight, saying, no eye will see me. He disguises his face. In the dark, they break into houses, which are marked for themselves in the daytime. They do not know the light. For the morning is the same to them as the shadow of death. If someone recognizes them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. All right. And so he's talking about, I think I meant to, let me go back here and look at my notes because I'm not looking at my notes the way I should. Okay. And so not only are they not punished, but they go totally unnoticed at times. I mean, sometimes we know these people. Sometimes people will say that's really a bad guy. He's a horrible guy. But Job says there are some who go unnoticed. They rebel against the light. They do their crimes in the night so that nobody can see them. They favor darkness so that they can go undetected in this world. They even disguise themselves so that nobody in the world would imagine them as anything other than what they display in the light when they're in the daytime. They sin willfully and against their own consciences. They know they're wrong. That's why they hide. That's why they act in the night. You know, a robber doesn't usually break in the middle of the daytime when the neighbors are on their front porches. We get this. This is what this conversation's about. They love the darkness. They love the night. We're told, you know, in the scriptures that there's no reason to be out in the night. That, you know, I used to, you know, that's why we give our children and our teenagers curfews, because there's not a lot of great things happening after midnight. I don't know if there's something happening after 9, but maybe. But that's a spiritual concept. God gave us the daylight to work and to work hard and to work in purpose. We have purpose given to us by God that the daylight supplies us an opportunity to do. And he talks about how they're willingly sinning against their own consciences. So they act to conceal their own true natures. And even then, God doesn't expose them. Even then, God lets them continue on in the darkness. They're safe if they're able to hide themselves from man because they forget that God sees them. So he talks about 3 types of sin here. We get this. This is all you have to do is watch a true crime show, right? I mean, we get this. He talks about murderers. They rise up with the light. They plot. They plan. They hatch the best way to do this, to kill somebody and get away with it. They don't walk into a building where there are 100 witnesses and shoot someone that they want dead. They may poison. They may plan a way to do it in the dark, in the night, when nobody's around. This is stuff that is not exposed because they themselves understand that they must hide their true nature. They just forget God is watching. God sees all of this, but man doesn't. There are a lot of people that get away with murder because they have hatched the kind of plan that allows them to do that. Adulterers, they hide and they're really ashamed of the sin, even in our culture today, even in the sense of where we are in our own culture, where many things are accepted, still adulterers hide their sins. They conceal. They hide for fear of jealousy, maybe. They hide because they're ashamed. They hide because their families would be disappointed. In every culture known to man, these are truths. People don't do crimes and commit crimes in the light. Not generally speaking. This is a truth. They take great pains to conceal it because it's not praised. And if they were to be found out, they would end up not with a good reputation. They want to be seen as those by men that do good. Job had been accused of many things. And he says, listen, there's murderers and there's adultery. There's people sleeping with their neighbors' wives in the dark, in the night. And they sneak out in the mornings and nobody knows. You think God's not watching this? It wasn't about Job's life and sin. He was not a hypocrite. They break into houses. We talked about this. They case the joint in the light. They mark the joint in the light. We know this happens so that they have an opportunity to go back in the best time to be undetected. Done all in the dark at night when no light can be detected and no sin can be detected. And finally, Job observes that they are in a continual terror because they don't want to be discovered. They don't want anybody to know. And so we see these true crime cases of somebody murders their wife and they interview them, and you see this chase and this constant and that turmoil and anxiety. Then the morning is the same to them as the shadow of death. If somebody recognized them, they would have terror. They're in terror that somebody might recognize them as the person that has done this. The light of day, which is welcome to an honest and a righteous person, which was true of Job, is a terror to bad people. They hate the sun. It discovers them. Shame came in with sin. And everlasting shame at the end is what all sinners have to deal with. And Job says, God may not punish immediately, but sinners are exposed to their continual frights. And yet, they see their own folly. They never fear God. They know they're guilty. They don't think about God and how he's going to deal with it. Isn't it interesting that God's eye is watching them and they never think about it? They are constantly figuring out a way to not be accused of what they have done. They're afraid of being discovered, and that's what's being discussed here. Job was not in this state. This was not true of Job, though he had been accused of such things. And so I think that is what's being discussed here. He goes on then to say, I'm going to read out of the Chuck Swindoll book here. I'll go back on that slide at the end of this slide here. This is just an interesting thing to think about, I think. The major message Job leaves us is fairly obvious by now. Even though God is elusive and mysterious, strange and silent, invisible and seemingly passive, he is trustworthy. In light of that, I want to suggest these three lessons that linger. First, resist the temptation to explain everything. God knows. Second, focus on the future benefits, not the present pain. God leads. And third, embrace the sovereignty of the Almighty because God controls. Refuse to believe that life is based on blind fate or random chance. Everything that happens, including the things that we cannot explain or justify, is being woven together like an enormous, beautiful piece of tapestry. From this earthly side, it seems blurred and knotted, strange and twisted. But from heaven's perspective, it has an incredible pattern. Best of all, it is for his greater glory. Right now, it seems so confusing, but someday the details will come together to make good sense. And so I think that is a beautiful way for us to consider what it is that God, I think I read that before this next passage. Okay, here we go. They should be swift on the face of the waters. Their portion should be cursed in the earth, so that no one would turn into the way of the vineyards. As drought and heat consume the snow water, so the grave consumes those who have sinned. The womb should forget him. The worm should feed sweetly on him. He should be remembered no more, and wickedness should be broken like a tree. For he preys on the barren who do not bear, and does no good for the widow. But God draws the mighty with his power. He raises up, but no man is sure of life. He gives them security, and they rely on it, yet his eyes are on their ways. They are exalted for little, then they are gone. They are brought low. They are taken out of the way like all others. They dry out like the heads of grain. Now, if it were not so, who will prove me a liar and make my speech worth nothing? And so what I just read out of the book, I was going to read at the end of this little conversation here that Job has. He continues his thoughts that are most helpful to us to remember, that life on earth does not equate to a righteous judgment, nor does it make sense to us. And that's why I love this quote when he talks about how it's just our lives are, everything we don't understand is part of the tapestry of the overall that we experience. More consideration is given to the wickedness of men that don't see this immediate punishment here in these verses. He says some people are like pirates of the sea. That's the way he begins this section. They become rich. They have a lot because they're good at choosing swift ships, and they're good at picking up prizes. And they're greater even than those who grow the vineyards. In fact, they can take away from the vineyards those who would make an honest living there. They can even persuade men who could find an honest work that there's a better way, that they can get rich quicker, that this is an easier way, that they don't have to work as hard. I mean, that's really what a lot of times what these guys that embezzle and cheat and commit fraud and even those on a lesser scale, just the ones who pick the pockets, think that it's easier than it is to go and work for 8 hours every day. And so even those who could have an honest living, they're tempted by those who are so good at what they do. There are sinful pursuits that many take so that they don't have to do the daily work in the vineyard. Job says, we all know this. Many wish to find this quick way of getting rich, like I said, and this unworthy nature rather than a daily wage. And some are abusive to those who are in trouble. Job says they don't mind taking advantage of other people in order to do this. Much of what he had said in the last text. But he says there are even people who add to the afflictions of others. I mean, he says they prey on the barren who don't bear, and they don't do any good for the widow. And you know, you think about Peninnah and what she did to Hannah. Just her words brought this great hurt on this woman who was barren and had not had a child. And he says there's all kinds of wickedness in the world. You know, it's not just the pirates of the sea. It's not those who are just trying to get it. Sometimes it's just people who are insensitive and say things that hurt other people's feelings, and who brag and flaunt goodness without even consideration of what others may or may not have. We can all be guilty of this, that we are insensitive to those who have had losses and disappointments, or we complain about things when we have so much more than somebody that we're talking to. I mean, shame on us. And we can easily be seen as those who do no good with our words when we are not sensitive of others' needs. And I'll tell you, that's just taking ourselves from thinking about ourselves all the time to thinking about other people. And Job says there's all kinds of people in the world. The world doesn't judge and deal fairly with the rich, the powerful, the weak, or the humble. There's no surety for anyone. There's not stability for anyone. The weak are under the inconsistent and unstable activity of the powerful. So you've got somebody in power, or who's your boss, or who has authority over you, and you can't really rely on them. And those in authority can't really rely on the yes men, the ones who are bidding their wishes. Man is not dependable. And Job said everybody finds themselves in these situations. You know, you're liable to be left behind by all kinds of people. But it is true. He shows that these daring sinners prosper and they're at ease for a while, and even sometimes often till the very end of their days. That it seems at times that even God protects evil men, so much so that they're at ease. And they have great comfort in their deceitful and dishonest practices because there's no immediate punishment, no negative impact on their life, which only strengthens their dependency on the evil ways. They begin to be so self-sufficient that they think that they don't need God. They don't need to think about a God. Their prosperity becomes their security. And that's what's being discussed here. They're exalted for a while, even feeling favored by the heavens. You know, they even feel like maybe I deserve this. Maybe this is because I'm so great. Because they're the greatest figures on the earth, they see themselves also above the heavens. They become greater even than the laws of the earth. We hear a lot about that in our culture these days. It's always existed. It's not new to us. Even empires of men in the past have had, I mean, the Caesars thought themselves to be God. So actually, Herod did that. That was, that was one of the problems with Herod when he was eaten by worms, was he appeared in that silver ray that made him, and they were all chanting that he was a god. It's always existed. And even among the ordinary, many find themselves thinking that certain laws don't apply to them. I mean, we are surrounded by people in our own lives that don't think rules apply to them, that this law surely doesn't mean me, that I'll just take somebody to court. Job says, can long lives like this be carried away without ever any notice of it? Yep. But they eventually will be carried away. They're carried out of this world very silently and gently and without disgrace and affliction, such as he was experiencing. He says they'll go down to the grave as easily as snow and water. Snowy water sinks into the ground when it's melted by the sun. That's how easy it is. And the worm would and the womb should forget him. In other words, the new people born don't think anything bad of him. They go to his grave and they think, oh my goodness, that man lived to be a long life, 100 years. My goodness, they don't know anything bad about him. I mean, full of graveyards that we go look at, and I wonder what these people must have been like. God never set a mark of displeasure on these people. Even people who live their lives like this, He's sweet food for the worm. He lies down quietly, not at all remembered for his sinful nature, just like all others. They're shut up in the graves and nobody even notices. Job and his friends had made assumptions based on what they could see. The friends had taken notice of man's afflictions and wrongfully concluded that evil was the source. Job rightfully here makes the observation in life that countered those conditions. So he concludes his train of thought here by foreseeing a fall after death. He doesn't specifically talk here so much about judgment, but he does talk about that they die at ease by God's eyes, but God's eyes are watching their ways. His eyes are on their ways, verse 23. He is watching. He keeps silent, yes, but he's watching. And though Job does not speculate here about what happens, he insinuates that the consequences will be justice when they die. The common experience of the grave consumes them. They're brought into darkness that they love so well. The bodies they pampered will will be the feast of worms. And the worms will just eat up those pleasures and sins. And though they would make a great name by their wealth and their power and their mighty achievements, everything just perishes with them. And they're forgotten. Even the womb doesn't remember. And their wickedness would be broken as a tree and buried with them. And their pride is brought down and laid in the dust and cut off. And you may search for them, but you cannot find them. And they are not in the place that shows them honor. Finally, he says, a challenge. So, you just tell me that's not right. When we speak truth, we have nothing to fear. Bring it on, he says. Test what I say. Now, Bildad's going to have one more little thing to say here. He says, then Bildad, the Shuhite, answered and said, dominion and fear belong to him. He makes peace in his high places. Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does his light not rise? How then can man be righteous before God, or how can he be pure who is born of a woman? If even the moon does not shine and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man who is a maggot and the son of man who is a worm? So finally, this very short response from Bildad, and this is the last recorded text from his friends. In a sense, he lands in agreement finally with the principles expressed about God and man. And they've all kind of done this throughout the conversations. He says, dominion and fear belong to him. God's sovereign. He's Lord of all. Everyone and everything belongs to him. He has undisputable authority to give laws and to enforce the laws he has given. He has the right to dispose, to save, to do whatever he wants to according to his will. Whatever he does is right, and he rules all creatures, great and small. That's what he says. That is true. He talks about how, now this is all under the assumption still that Job is a hypocrite, that Job has done something. And so he talks about how Job, really the insinuation is, Job, you're going to have to deal with this kind of a God. He says he makes peace in his high places. The glorious and holy inhabitants of this upper world all see him. This is the God that we're talking about here, Job. He says, all of these inhabitants, everybody who lives in these heavenly places, they all know him. They all worship and submit to him. And peace. He makes peace in the high places. You think of that. He enjoys perfect tranquility, as do everybody who's in his presence, as does everybody who's in his presence. The holy angels don't quarrel with each other and they don't pick on each other. This is, remember the Jews we talked about, they talked of the first heavens, the second heavens, the third heavens. This is Bildad talking about the huge picture of what Job is wanting to stand before. And so he talks of this unimaginable being. And he says there's just this perfect tranquility in this, and that there's no bickering. The angels and the heavenly beings aren't criticizing one another. They're all these just beings, and they are there to honor and worship and do the will of the Father, the Almighty. They don't argue with him. They don't complain. You know, he's accusing Job. Job, they're not arguing with God. He's accusing Job of arguing with God, of taking God to task, of pleading for a day in court with God. And he says that's not what's happening above. There's peace above. And even the stars and the moon and the sun, they keep in their courses. They don't clash into each other. There's no nonsense. Peace is at work. He says, Bildad says he's a God of power. And he says, is there any number in his armies? There's no power on earth that compares to the armies that God has, Job. That's who you want to contend with. That's who you're calling into your presence. He has standing armies that are so well disciplined. They never rebel. They never fail. They're never outfought. His providence is for all, he says, upon whom does not his light rise. The light of the sun is communicated to all parts of the world. He's good to all. The earth is full of his goodness. How then can a man be justified with God? You want him to come and you're going to plead your case? Or how can he be clean? Man is not only mean, but he's vile and he's unclean. He can't be justified. He cannot be clean. But God, in him, there's no error. There's no mistake. There's no uncleanliness. How can man who is guilty and impure appear before his perfection? He shows how dark and defective the heavenly bodies are in the sight of God in comparison with him. I mean, he talks about if even the moon doesn't shine and the stars aren't pure in his sight. I mean, he says the lights of heaven, as beautiful as they are to God like balls of clay, dull dust. He made them. He shaped them. They're nothing. Behold, even the moon, the things that charm us most and are even worshipped, by the way, by some men and women, the stars and the moon and the astrology and the skies. They're nothing in comparison to God's glory. They don't even shine in comparison to God's glory. They aren't pure. They have no glory. God's glory overshadows and makes hidden the brightest creatures on the earth. And so we who do not shine as the moon or sparkle like the stars, even though man is noble and made in God's image, before man, we're like the worms of the earth. We're like maggots, he says. We're the smallest of creatures, unlookable, not discerned by most, little and inconsiderable in comparison to God and his angels. I mean, we started in the heavens, for heaven's sakes. Bildad did. Of course, Job's not going to have any comparison to what's happening in the high places. He says, we're so worthless, no reason to be proud, so weak, so easily crushed, and therefore an impossible match for God. So we have finally arrived at the overall contest of God and man. How can man contend with God? Job, you say you want to contend with, you hold yourself righteous before God. You say you're not a hypocrite. You really want to contend with this? Everything was true that Bildad said. It was just not addressed to the right person. And it wasn't right concerning the afflictions which Job was experiencing. That is the last that the friends will speak. And now we'll start in these chapters of Job answering. His answer goes all the way through 31. There's no way we'll be able to get to all of this tonight. I'm hoping to finish, though, all of Job's discourse before the end of next week's lesson. We'll see. If not, we'll continue it later. It's not a big deal. I'd rather not rush, though. Job answered and said, how have you helped him who's without power? Why'd you come? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? And how have you declared sound advice to many, to whom you have uttered words and whose spirit came from you? Good grief, Job says. Why did you come? What good have you done with your words? It seems from Job's words that these friends were proud of their wisdom and their thoughts that they brought over the course of these conversations. Well, Job points out that in all their wise words, he is in the same situation that he was before, that their words have brought no relief. They've brought no true reflection. Though he thought he had spoken very clearly and had declared in such a beautiful way that nobody had questioned, Bildad had not done that. Job said, no. In fact, nothing good has been done by your words. All the words, no good's come. What a waste of time, both to man and to God. No service had been done for God. Nothing good had been done for Job. God does not need us to speak for him, as Job accuses his friends of assuming they had done. And Job says, you can continue to act as if you have helped, but it is not true. You have not. Even in the accurate and truthful words that you have given over the course of these conversations, you have been useless and you've been ineffective because you have made assumptions that are not true and you have no real understanding. And we've talked about this over and over in this class. We have to really, really consider Job's friends because we can be guilty of this. To one faithful man who was humbled, who was broken, who was grieving, they had brought words to wound. Not words of grace, not words of mercy, not words of love. Compassion had left, love was veiled, and understanding seemed unreachable. And that's the way Job begins his closing comments. He said, the dead tremble, those under the water and those inhabiting them. Sheol is naked before him, and destruction has no covering. He stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. He binds up the water in his thick clouds, yet the clouds are not broken under it. He covers the face of his throne and spreads his cloud over it. He drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters at the boundary of the light and the darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his rebuke. He stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding he breaks up the storm. By his spirit he adorned the heavens. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Indeed, these are mere edges of his ways. And how shall a whisper we hear of him? And how small a whisper we hear of him? But the thunder of his power, who can understand? Job will give many truths that have already been brought out in many ways, truths that they all agree on. If we look about us, he says, if we look at the earth, and if we look at the waters here below, we see the striking instances of power and of presence. He says he hangs the earth on nothing. This globe rests on nothing. It doesn't hang on anything from anything, like a swing on a tree branch. It's not hanging. It's just suspended. The power of God, spoken instructions, maintains the balance of its own weight. He sets bounds to the water, boundaries. He makes them stop so that they don't cover the land as God deems right. And those boundaries remain steadfast and unmoved and unshaken. And he forms dead things underneath the waters. He He forms everything underneath the water, things that we don't even know about, things that come and live and die, and we never even are aware. He controls the creatures we don't see, the great creatures of the sea we never understand. He forms and he rules. And by mighty storms, he shakes the mountains, the pillars of the heavens. He can divide them in two. He divides the sea. He smites through the proud waters. Verse 12, at the presence of the Lord, the sea flies and the mountains skip. Psalms 114, a storm can divide and furrow the water of the sea, and then the calm smites the water and it lays completely flat. It's all controlled by God. And when hell is considered, Job says, I'll just talk about hell. It's out of our sight. Yet we may conceive the instances of God's power even there. The grave, those buried in the grave under the eye of God, though we can no longer see them, they're no longer seen by us. God sees. They're always within his sight. You ever thought about that? Even the dead, unhidden to him, are those in the grave. God knows where to receive a resurrected body, even if it's blown to bits in an explosion, so that we never find anything. God's got it. He's got a resurrected body. He always knows. He sees. And I believe even those who are left for hell, separated from God, are always within his view, naked before him. Nothing is hidden. This is a really interesting thing to think about. Our souls forever separated from God in hell, and yet God sees each always. Revelation 14:10 speaks of the sinners who are tormented in the sight of the angels and in the presence of the Lamb. It's not that these evil people just die to the grave and the worms eat them. God takes care of it all. He's still watching. They're still souls. And if we look to the heaven above, we see instances of God's sovereignty and power. He stretches out the north over the empty place. Verse 7, stretched out the heavens like a curtain. He keeps the waters above the firmament so that they don't just explode and empty themselves completely upon the earth. He binds them up in the thick clouds as if they're closed in a bag until he needs them. Actually, he even describes later in the book of Job, and we'll look at that, he's got a pantry full of clouds that he'll take one out and just shake it. He uses them like we do in a recipe when we get our salt out. I mean, this is the God that Bildad and these men have talked about. And Job says, I know this. And he has mercy on the earth, Job says, so that he doesn't just dump it or let the stars rain down fire upon us. He conceals the glory of the upper world, things too wonderful for us to even behold, things we could not take in. He holds back the face of his throne. The light which he dwells and spreads, it has a cloud between us and them. He sits and he judges, but yet we can't see because we've got these clouds between us and him. God allows us, therefore, to live by faith so that judgment might be fair. They weren't going to answer all the questions. They weren't going to know all the truths. They weren't going to understand all the afflictions. They were not going to understand the day that the Chaldeans came. Verse 13, the bright ornaments of the heaven are the work of his spirit. As it moved above the water, so it also decorated the heavens. He makes us look up and wonder. We're dazzled by the stars and the moon, their number, their order, the glory that decorates our own view. Its canopy above our heads. It leads us to praise our Creator. And it only leads us to yearn even more for the grave, that we might see and imagine what is beyond. For if our earth has such unimaginable beauty, can you even begin to imagine what heaven must be? And finally, he concludes, we just know the very edges of very, very little about it all. He agrees with all the observations that's been made by his friend. He admires the depth of that which is undiscovered. This is a part of his ways. What we know about God is nothing in comparison to what God is. After all the discoveries which God has made to us, and all the questions that he has made, that we've made after God, still we are much in the dark concerning him. We have very little. This is a quote by Matthew Henry. He is infinite and incomprehensible. Our understanding and capacities are weak and shallow. And the full discoveries of the divine glory are reserved for the future state. Even the thunder of his power, that is his powerful thunder, one of the lowest of his ways here in our own region, we can't understand. See chapter 37, verse 4, when God comes in the thunder. That's the only way to describe his voice. Much less can we understand the utmost force and extent of his power, the terrible efforts and operations of it, and particularly the power of his anger. Psalm 90:11, God is great, and we know him not. And so, let's see, it's 8:00, isn't it? I will stop there. We will start here in chapter 27 next week. Let me go ahead and stop my recording. Whoops.